3 people disappeared in the Smoky Mountains, each leaving behind a final clue that only made the mystery more disturbing. Because when the same strange pattern appears across 3 separate cases, it becomes much harder to believe that nothing connects them. It's good to have you back. This is The Last Walk. Asheville sits close to the mountains, where outdoor shops are filled with trail maps, weathered packs, and people planning where they want to go next. In one of those shops, Jonas Bexley spent his days helping customers choose boots, compare gear, and talk through routes he often knew from experience. Jonas was 34 and spent much of his free time outdoors. On October 17, 2018, he packed for one night in the Smokies and headed out before sunrise. His sister described him as careful about trips. He carried a paper map even when the route was saved on his phone, checked the weather before leaving, and packed more food than he expected to need. A small headlamp stayed in the top pocket of his bag, where he could reach it without unpacking everything. To the people who knew him, this was simply another overnight hike. The trip seemed straightforward enough. Start from a high trailhead, follow the main route north, spend one night at a backcountry campsite, then return the following afternoon. He had done longer trips. He had handled colder weather. The distance was not the kind of thing that would have impressed anyone at the shop where he worked. He told his sister where he planned to start and said he would check in once he reached camp if he found service. That was never a guarantee out there. Long sections of the route had no signal at all, especially once the trail climbed away from the road. Still, it gave her a rough sense of where he would be and roughly when she might hear from him. The forecast called for rain later that day, along with colder air at higher elevation. In October, that is not the kind of thing that cancels a hike. It means wet leaves, muddy roots, a rain shell, maybe a colder night than planned. Jonas had packed for exactly that. There was no severe weather alert tied to the route when he left, and no reason for anybody to treat the trip like the start of a rescue. He left before sunrise and reached the trailhead while the parking lot was still mostly empty. His vehicle was still there the following day, parked in the same spot. Inside were ordinary things that suggested he expected to return soon. A change of clothes on the back seat, a few snack wrappers, and a gas station receipt from outside town. Nothing had been damaged, and there was no sign that he had planned to leave the area another way. His Great Smoky Mountains National Park backcountry permit listed both the route and his reserved campsite. That meant park rangers had a documented plan to work from once he failed to return. The trail began through lower hardwood forest, where the grade was manageable and the ground was still covered in wet leaves from rain the night before. Farther in, it climbed toward narrower ridgeline sections with steeper side slopes. It was not the most remote part of the Smokies, but it was remote enough that help was never close. Once someone moved beyond the trailhead, there were long stretches with no road access and no quick way for anyone to reach them. That makes me think about how misleading a marked trail can be. You're following a route that thousands of other people have walked, so it still feels connected to the world you left behind. But after a few miles, the road is gone, your phone might be useless, and the nearest help could be hours away. That stretch of forest that morning would have been quiet in the way October mornings usually are around there. Damp bark, the smell of wet leaves, birds moving somewhere overhead but never quite visible. Nothing about it suggested anything was wrong. It was simply a quiet trail on an ordinary morning before the sky started doing something else. I think that first hour is the part people underestimate the most. Everything still feels like a normal hike, right? Cool air, damp ground, a little effort up the uphill sections. You warm up, you settle into a pace, and the whole day feels like it's going according to plan. Sometimes it is. Sometimes you are just gaining elevation towards something else entirely. No one recorded Jonas stepping onto the trail. There were no cameras once the road disappeared behind him, and nobody at the trailhead had any reason to remember one more hiker heading out alone. The first confirmed sighting came later that morning from a southbound hiker coming the other direction. After Jonas's photograph was shared, a hiker contacted the search team and reported seeing someone who matched his description on the lower section of the trail before noon. He remembered the large pack, the dark rain shell tied around it, and the way Jonas kept a steady pace as he climbed. Nothing about him seemed hurried or unusual enough to draw a second look. That was all he could honestly offer. Most trail encounters work exactly like that. You pass someone, maybe nod, notice the color of a jacket, then keep walking. You are not expecting that person to become the last confirmed sighting in a missing person case. The hiker continued south, Jonas continued north. No other verified witness placed him on the trail again. By early afternoon, the weather had started shifting. Records from the nearest monitoring station showed rain becoming steadier across the higher elevations, temperatures dropping as the front moved through, wind increasing along exposed ridgeline. None of that tells us what Jonas was doing at any given moment. It only tells us what the mountain itself was doing while he was still known to be out there. The next solid clue came from a photograph that had automatically synced to Jonas's cloud account. It showed a section of trail opening briefly through the trees, with low clouds gathering over a ridge in the distance. Near the edge of the frame, one orange trail marker was visible on a tree trunk. The photo was timestamped 4:47. At first, that felt like the kind of detail that should make the search smaller. A photo, a trail marker, a specific time. But the route had several stretches of similar forest, similar markers, similar openings in the canopy, and rain and fog had already begun changing how the ridge looked by the time searchers reviewed the image. They could place it within a general section of trail, they could not pin it to one exact spot. 4:47 in the afternoon, in mid-October, is not full darkness. But under a canopy that thick, with cloud cover pressing down and rain moving in, the light can fade much earlier than expected.
Jonas was not caught out after dark in the way people usually picture it. The sky may still have looked bright, while the trail beneath the trees was already becoming difficult to see.
There were no messages after the photograph, no outgoing calls, and no more images. At 4:47, the phone stopped transmitting and never came back online. That did not necessarily mean the battery had died. The phone could have lost service, been damaged, or simply stopped connecting once Jonas moved farther down the slope. From that moment on, every possibility led somewhere different. By evening, visibility along the higher ground had dropped. Rain had worked into the leaf cover and over the exposed rock. The same trail that looked routine that morning now had wet roots, slick slopes, and long stretches where the tree line blocked most of the sky. You do not need a dramatic cliff for ground like that to become a problem. A little distance downhill is enough to turn into a completely different piece of terrain. Jonas was supposed to check in that night, but when no message came, his sister was not immediately alarmed. She knew the route had poor reception, and he had planned to spend the night at the campsite. He could have been in a dead zone, tired after a wet afternoon and already settling in for the night. By the next day, the silence was harder to explain. She had called and messaged him several times without a response. Jonas had not returned home, and his car was still at the trailhead. What had first seemed like a missed check-in had become an entire day with no sign of him. Park rangers and search and rescue teams began with the records they could verify. Jonas's backcountry permit, the southbound hiker's sighting, the final photograph recovered from his cloud account, and the campsite he had reserved. Teams checked the main trail first, then the campsite, the junctions, and the ridgeline sections where the weather had hit hardest. They also checked places where someone might have tried to get out of the wind or wait for the rain to ease. Shallow overhangs, clusters of fallen trees, and lower ground beside the trail were searched before teams began moving deeper into the drainage. Rain had continued through the night, and that mattered. By the time anyone began looking, the leaves were flattened wet against the ground, and water had run through the shallow channels beside the trail. A footprint, if one had ever existed there, was no longer something anyone could count on. A drainage looks simple from a map. It is a shaded line falling away from a trail. On the ground, it is brush, loose rock, wet leaves, fallen trees, and multiple ways for a person or an object to end up somewhere lower down.
I would have guessed the map would make this search smaller. It ended up doing the opposite.
Several days in, searchers found Jonas's folded paper map beneath a low branch about 60 feet below the trail. It was wet, torn along one edge, marked with the same route listed on his permit. His name and emergency contact were written inside the cover. One corner of the map was missing, the part that showed the approach toward his planned campsite. Searchers checked the branch, then worked farther down the slope. That section of map was never recovered. Neither was his pack, his headlamp, or his phone. That left searchers with an odd split in the evidence. The one item designed to show where Jonas was going had been found, while everything he would have carried with him afterward was still missing. Near the same spot, searchers photographed two elongated depressions in the wet slope below the branch. Both had rounded edges, but the rain had damaged them so badly that no one could determine whether they were footprints, marks left by shifting debris, or simply shapes formed by runoff. They were documented in the search log, but there was nothing clear enough to cast or identify. The map placed something belonging to Jonas below the trail. It did not say how it got there. It could have slipped from an outer pocket, it could have been dropped while he checked his route, it could have been carried downhill by runoff after the rain. The evidence gave searchers somewhere to look. It did not give them a story.
I think finding the map may have made the search harder in a different way. It confirmed that something belonging to Jonas had reached the slope below, but every explanation for how it got there sent searchers in another direction.
The search widened through the surrounding forest and into the drainage below, then returned to the same ground again after the weather improved. No further evidence could be linked to Jonas with certainty. Jonas Bexley was never located. His case remains open. The next disappearance happened under very different circumstances. Delbert Keteridge was not heading for a trail at all. He stopped at a quiet roadside pull-off, the kind of place people use to stretch their legs, look out over the trees for a minute, then get back in the car. It was January 30th, 2021. Delbert Keteridge lived and worked east of Knoxville in the foothills outside Great Smoky Mountains National Park. Maintenance requests were already piling up at the small apartment complex, where the 48-year-old handled most of the repairs. A co-worker who ran into him earlier that morning, before any errands had started, said Delbert seemed like himself, joking about the cold and asking if the co-worker had winterized his own car yet. There was nothing unusual about him, no sign anything was wrong, just an ordinary start to a Saturday that ended the way most weekends do. That Saturday, receipts and phone records later placed him running errands through the afternoon. A grocery store, a gas station, then the longer road that curved into the mountains as daylight started thinning out. The gas station stop was captured on camera, Delbert in jeans, work boots, and a winter jacket, nothing about his clothing suggesting he planned to go far on foot. There was no note left at home, no detailed plan texted to anyone. There was no map in his car, no backpack, and nothing packed for a long hike. The pull-off where his car was later found sat above a wooded slope and was easy to miss from the road. It was little more than a strip of gravel beside a low guardrail, with bare branches opening just enough to reveal the dark ridgelines in the distance. Somewhere below, a narrow creek wound through the trees. There was no marked trail leading down, no sign pointing toward the creek, and no steps suggesting anyone was meant to walk there. Beyond the guardrail, the slope was covered in loose leaves and exposed roots. The ground had frozen overnight, then softened again during the day. From the road, it looked like an ordinary stretch of woods. Once you stepped past the guardrail, it became steep, unstable ground.
I've pulled over at places just like that more than once without giving much thought to what was beyond the guardrail. From inside the car, it looks like scenery. You only realize how rough the ground is once you step into it.
Delbert's vehicle was found locked and parked facing the road, not hidden, not damaged, nothing that suggested he left in a hurry. His thermos sat in the front seat. His wallet and a set of spare keys were inside. The driver's seat was pushed back the way he normally kept it, and a grocery bag sat on the floor behind the passenger seat. His main keys were gone. So was his phone. That suggested he had locked the car himself and expected to use it again. What it could not show was whether he had stepped away for a quick look over the guardrail or intended to follow the creek for a while. The last connection from that phone came at 5:08 that evening, reaching a tower that covered a wide stretch of road, the pull-off, the wooded slope, and part of the creek drainage below. A tower connection sounds like it should narrow things down. In terrain like that, it does not. One connection can cover a road, a ridge, and a low area near water all at once. It gives you a general area. It does not give you a route. The search area looked manageable on a map, but it included two sides of the road, the slope below the pull-off, sections of creek, and higher ground beyond the tower. A single phone connection had placed Delbert almost everywhere and nowhere at the same time. There were no calls or messages after that, no later purchases, and no camera footage showing him anywhere else. His phone activity stopped at 5:08, while his car remained at the pull-off through the night. So what had happened after he arrived there? The temperature fell below freezing after sunset. By morning, Delbert still had not answered his sister's calls. At first, she assumed he was sleeping late or had gone out to run another errand. When he was still unreachable that afternoon, she drove to his apartment. It was empty, and his work clothes were already laid out for his next shift. Nothing inside suggested he had planned to stay away. She reported him missing to the county sheriff's office and described his car. Deputies used that description and the broad area covered by his last phone connection to check roadside pull-offs. After they located the vehicle, volunteer search teams joined deputies in working the slope and creek below it. They began at the guardrail, checked the gravel shoulder, then moved down into the brush toward the creek. The slope did not fall in one clean line. It broke into small drops, root systems, and narrow channels cut by runoff. A person could move downhill in one direction, then get pushed sideways by brush or water without leaving anything close to a visible track. A slope like that can turn one wrong step into several possible directions before anyone even knows where to begin looking. Once water, leaves, and changing temperatures have worked over the ground, even the first direction he took can disappear. 2 days later, a searcher found a dark knit cap caught between rocks near the creek, pressed into a spot where leaves and small branches had collected after runoff. Delbert's sister identified it by a small repair she had sewn along the edge the winter before.
That kind of detail changes an object completely. A plain cap could belong to anybody. A repair somebody made with their own hands is different. It gives you one clear thread connecting a person to a landscape that otherwise holds nothing of them.
Near the same stretch of creek, a searcher photographed one partial depression in the mud along the waterline. It was elongated and uneven, but rising water had already washed away most of its edges. The search log described it only as an unidentified ground mark. There was no second impression, no direction of travel, and no way to determine whether it had anything to do with Delbert. The cap was found roughly 200 yards below the pull-off. No phone, no keys. No clear tracks explaining whether Delbert had walked to the creek, slipped toward it, or lost the cap somewhere above and had it carried down by water. Searchers followed the creek in both directions, checked nearby roads, and worked through areas where the slope eased enough for someone to move through the trees. Ice had formed overnight in the shaded sections, and the ground stayed slick well into the week. I can understand why the cap became so important to the search. It was the only thing found near the creek that clearly belonged to Delbert, but it still could not tell anyone whether he had made it down there himself. Search coordinators later said the daily freeze and thaw was one of the hardest parts of that stretch. Ice formed in the shaded sections by early morning, then melted into mud by afternoon, changing the ground from one day to the next. Whatever had been visible on the first night was rarely still there by the second. Delbert Keteridge was never located. His car, the final phone connection, and the repaired knit cap were the only solid points the sheriff's office and search teams could return to. Everything after he stepped away from the pull-off remains unknown. The next case began differently. She had someone with her, and for a while, there was a clear account of where she had been. It was September 9th, 2023. Alicia Everheart was 29 years old and lived in Chattanooga. She worked at a dental office during the week and had driven into Great Smoky Mountains National Park that Saturday with a friend for an easy afternoon walk along a maintained creek trail. They were not carrying overnight packs or planning to cover any real distance. The trail was short, familiar, and close to the parking area. The plan was simple. Walk out to a small footbridge, take a few pictures near the water, then head back before dinner. They had checked the forecast that morning. Mild weather, rain expected later, nothing severe when they arrived. The trail had been busy earlier in the day. Families and couples moving through the first section near the lot, the creek running loud enough beside the path that people had to raise their voices near the water. Her friend said she had been keeping pace with him and had not complained about feeling tired or unwell. They stopped near the footbridge for a while, and when they continued, she still had everything she had brought with her. As far as he could tell, it had been a normal hike. This was not a remote ridge, and that matters. The trail was maintained, the footbridge was a familiar stopping point, and the parking area was close by. But familiar does not always mean safe or easy. Beyond the bridge, the trees grew thicker, the creek dropped below the trail, and the ground outside the maintained path quickly became steep and uneven. The change can happen so quietly that you barely notice it. One minute, you are on a family trail near the parking lot. A few steps later, the ground beside you feels like a completely different place. Alicia's phone had synced several photographs to her cloud account earlier that day, allowing park rangers and law enforcement to review them later. The phone itself was never recovered. The last image was timestamped 4:36 that afternoon. By late afternoon, foot traffic had thinned. The trail was not empty, but the steady rhythm of passing other hikers every few minutes had changed. At the bridge, Alicia took pictures near the railing and along the bank while her friend adjusted a loose strap on his bag. Past the bridge, the trail continued a short distance before bending through thicker trees and climbing away from the water. A narrow slope dropped off on one side. Not a dramatic cliff, just the kind of edge people walk past without thinking much of it because the path itself feels secure. Alicia started walking ahead after the photos. Her friend said he could still see her through the trees for a short distance before the trail curved out of sight. He finished with the strap and kept moving, expecting to catch up around the bend. She was not there. He looked up the trail, where the trees opened slightly as the ground began to rise, and called her name. When she did not answer, he walked a little farther before turning back toward the bridge. He thought she might have stopped near the creek or gone back to take another picture, but she was not there. He tried her phone. The first call connected, but went unanswered. The second went straight to voicemail. That does not tell anyone where the phone was in that moment. It only tells us it was still active long enough for the first call to reach it. Anyone who has hiked with another person has probably lived some version of this. One of you stops, the other gets a little ahead. You assume you will see them at the next turn. That is what makes this part of the timeline so hard to sit with. The distance between normal and wrong was not measured in miles. It was a few minutes, on a trail they picked because it felt short and easy. He checked the bank, walked a stretch between the bridge and the bend again, called out again. The creek was loud below the trail, and the light under the trees had already begun fading faster than it looked from the open lot behind them. He went back for help. A trail camera positioned below the path was reviewed during the search. It had captured Alicia passing the bend alone shortly after the final photograph at the bridge. No later image showed her returning in the opposite direction, giving search teams one final confirmed sighting beyond her friend's account. Park rangers and NPS search and rescue personnel gathered near the footbridge that evening. Using her friend's timeline and the timestamps from photographs saved to Alicia's cloud account, they narrowed the initial search to the section between the bridge and the bend. Teams marked the sections they had covered so they could return at first light. By then, however, the creek had risen and the ground below the trail no longer looked the way it had when Alicia disappeared. By morning, the creek was higher and louder. Wet leaves had flattened into the soil, and water moved through small channels that had been dry the day before. The area was small compared to Jonas's route or Delbert's drainage, but the terrain below the path was thick, sloped, and hard to see through.
I think a smaller search area can sometimes create false hope. It sounds manageable until you see how many hiding places can exist between one short section of trail.
On the second day, a search team found Alicia's compact camera hanging by its strap from a low branch about 80 feet below the trail, hidden from anyone walking above. The camera body was scratched, but the strap and lens cap were still in place. Its final image was the one taken at the footbridge. There was nothing afterward to show when the camera left her hands.
That's the detail that gets me. The camera survived, but whatever happened between the bridge and that branch left no record at all.
80 feet sounds close when it is just a number. It stops sounding close once you realize there is no path between you and it. You step around roots, grab at branches, slide through wet leaves, and lose sight of the trail above almost immediately. Near a fallen log below the camera, searchers photographed a partial mark in the soft ground. Rain had blurred its edges, and the image did not show enough detail to determine what had made it. Weeks later, someone reviewing the separate search photographs noticed that its general shape resembled marks documented in the Jonas and Delbert searches. But the photographs had been taken from different angles, in different soil, and under different conditions. No reliable comparison could be made. Searchers worked the ground below the camera, followed the creek bank, and checked every route back toward the path. They expanded downstream, checked side paths, and returned to that same slope again and again as the weather shifted. Within the following weeks, the search moved farther downstream, past bends in the creek that were harder to reach on foot. Crews checked snagged debris, undercut banks, and anywhere the current might have carried something. The creek kept running the entire time, indifferent to how long anyone had been looking. No further trace of Alicia was ever found. Her friend's timeline, the timestamps on her photographs, and the trail camera image from below the path became the final confirmed pieces of the case. What happened after she passed that bend remains unknown. 3 people disappeared on 3 different days, years apart. Jonas Bexley had planned his route and carried enough supplies for an overnight trip. Delbert Keteridge pulled over beside a mountain road with no sign that he intended to go far. Alicia Everheart vanished while walking a familiar creek trail with a friend. The 3 cases were compared only after they had already been treated as separate missing person investigations. The common points came from backcountry permit records, search logs, vehicle locations, phone and photograph timestamps, witness accounts, family identification of recovered belongings, and photographs taken during the searches. None of those records proves the disappearances were connected. The final confirmed activity in each case occurred during late afternoon, but that timing is not especially unusual in the mountains. People are still hiking or driving at that hour. Daylight is beginning to weaken, weather can shift quickly, and families may not yet realize that someone is missing. The times are close enough to feel eerie when placed beside one another, but they occurred in different months and different years. The marks are even weaker as evidence. None was complete enough to cast, measure reliably, or identify. They may have been footprints, damage from debris, shapes created by runoff, or unrelated disturbances in the ground. Their photographs could not establish that the same person, animal, or object had made them. What made the cases unsettling was something simpler. In every search, the last personal object recovered was found downhill or below the route where the missing person had last been confirmed. Near each object, searchers had also documented a partial mark they could not explain. It was an eerie coincidence noticed only after the cases were compared, not proof that something had followed all 3 people. On paper, these remain 3 separate disappearances. Maybe that is all they are, but each case reaches the same point and then breaks off. The trail continues. The road remains open. The creek keeps moving. Somewhere between one ordinary moment and the next, a person is simply gone. Searchers recovered enough to identify the final known area in each case, but never enough to determine what happened there. The marks may mean nothing at all. The frightening part is that, after 3 separate searches, they remain among the few details that no one could explain.
For now, we leave the mountains to their secrets. I'll see you again soon.